Welcome back to How to Fix Democracy, Series 5, where we are looking at 100 years of American democracy between 1924 and 2024. In our series so far, we've been focusing on the 20s and 30s, on the Great Depression, on the various presidents, on the rights of women, but we haven't had a show specifically focusing on the question of race and of Black Americans, of African Americans in the politics and history of America in the 20s and 30s. So I'm thrilled that we have one of America's foremost experts on Black history in the 20s and 30s, Professor Jill Watts, the author of The Black Cabinet, and a real authority on the challenges and opportunities, the good and bad news for Black Americans in the 20s and 30s. So Jill, welcome to How to Fix Democracy.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Jill, let's begin with the First World War. Your book, The Black Cabinet, which is an exceptionally lucid and engaging narrative about the challenges of Black history in the early part of the 20th century. Begins before the First World War with Taft and Teddy Roosevelt. But let's fast forward a little bit to 1918. In broad terms, and I know this is a hard question, so perhaps excuse its breadth, but what was the political state of Black America as America came out of the First World War?
I think initially the political state was hopeful. During the war, Black Americans stepped up and they fought. And there was a debate previous when the war was coming. And W. Du Bois said, hey, we've got to close ranks. We go and fight. We prove ourselves and we come home fighting. And the nation can't turn its back on us after we've sacrificed and helped make the world safe for democracy, right? And initially people came home and I think they were very hopeful. And I think coming on the heels of that, that women's suffrage is going to come through too. And that's in the air. It's been debated. President Wilson comes forward and endorses it. And what's so interesting, and a lot of people don't take into account, is that as that's starting to roll, there's a lot of good reason to be hopeful, because not just because of the sacrifices of the war, but also because if women's suffrage gets passed, that means Black women throughout the nation would, at least in theory, gain the right to vote. And that would enrich the number of Black voters. So I think there was a hopefulness. The reality, however, is right after the war, there's a backlash against the Black community. And we have Red Summer of 1919, where white soldiers are returning from war and they become competitive for the jobs that Black men had taken, predominantly Black men, but also Black women had taken in the war industry. And then it also kind of dovetails with the Great Migration out of the South that commences in 1915, where people are being drawn north for jobs and opportunity and education. They're leaving behind that Jim Crow South. And once the war is over, job opportunities really shrink for Black people in the North, and white resentment for the presence of Black people in the North grows, in the North and the Midwest both. And so you have a real, you had a moment of hope, and then the door slams shut again. But every time that door slams shut, Black people fight back. And I think that's what's really important. So immediately right after the war, you find that as that door slams shut, people are reorienting and getting ready for more activism.
Jill, the first show in our Series 5 was with Adam Hochschild, who's written a wonderful book about the repressive nature of politics in 1917 and 18 in America. The state assault on unions, on pacifists, and on the left in general. How much was the dilemma of African Americans, of the black community coming out of the war, similar to the problems of unions and of the left and of the progressive community in general?
I think that they run very similarly on similar tracks in terms of the repressiveness of the state during the war impacted black Americans. If you look at A. Philip Randolph, who is the organizer of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and Maids, he has a rough go of it during the war, and he's censored like many of the other leaders. And so yeah, I believe that what Rothschild, right?
Hochschild. Adam Hochschild.
Apologies. What he argues is there's a broader umbrella under which black Americans actually fall. So they're impacted by this too. It's another impediment to the struggle for equal rights.
Jill, in your book, you write about the way in which black America was taken advantage by different politicians of different parties for their own political interests, whether it was Woodrow Wilson, Taft, or Teddy Roosevelt. Wilson, I think, and perhaps correct me if I'm wrong, comes out of this looking particularly bad in terms of seducing, if that's the right word, black America with it, and then turning his back on it. How would you describe the politics of race and of black America in the context of the two political parties in 1918, or indeed in 1924? Of course, it's very, very different from the politics of America, the racial politics of America in 2024.
Right. I don't know that there's a lot of difference between 1918 and 1924, except that black women get the right to vote, and they're really mobilizing by 24 to be an impact in that election. So, but, in 1918, you have Woodrow Wilson, who's ensconced in the presidency. And I don't even know if I would say that he really seduced the black population. What black voters were doing, at that time, were kind of trying to decide who was the lesser of two evils, because the Republicans hadn't done a whole lot for them. And then there was some hope that maybe Wilson would come through with federal appointments or something. But a lot of people were skeptical of that because he was a white Southerner and a white Virginian, and kind of proved himself to be that. I mean, he drove through Jim Crow segregation in the federal government. He fired black advisors, replaced them with white advisors in positions that have been held by black Americans for decades. And so with that advent of Wilson's administration and his neglect of the black population, but more than that, just the aggressive attempts to turn back the clock, at least within federal service in Washington, D.C., and then his support for the broader black agenda, that produces this atmosphere where you think, well, okay, the party of Lincoln's going to be back in office as of 1920, maybe in that period of time with Harding, and then Harding passes away with Coolidge, maybe we're going to be able to make some progress. And so you find black Americans saying, hey, this might be it again, the party of Lincoln's back. And that doesn't happen. Actually, nobody really overturns anything that Wilson was doing at that point. The offices remain segregated. There are very few black appointments, and actually throughout the 1920s, the number of black federal advisors declines. And like I said, nobody overturns the Jim Crow segregation in Washington, D.C. None of those Republicans rise to that moment. And it presents a real dilemma for black Americans. Where do I put my vote? Black Americans historically have supported the Republican Party by that point because it was the party of Lincoln. The hope of Reconstruction came out of reunifying the country and giving black people the vote right after the Civil War. That's the period of Reconstruction. That hope kind of persists in the black community that that's going to resurge. But you don't see it. And then with the 20s, the kind of hope again, well, maybe this crop of Republicans is going to live up to that promise. And they don't. They don't do it.
I know it's hard to talk about an average black American in the 1920s, but if there was one, what were the foremost issues? Lynching, addressing the meta issues of Reconstruction and of this almost apartheid system that had been built in the post-Civil War South, economic rights, sexual and cultural rights. Are there generalizations, Jill, one can make about the Black community in America in the 20s?
I think that's one of the big mistakes people make, is thinking of the Black community as a monolith, right? But in some ways, if you think about the dominant culture's mindset, what the Black community faces is a monolith. You know, Jim Crow segregation is legal in the South, but it's de facto in the North, in the West, and the Midwest. Lynchings, they don't just occur in the South. And with the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan, you find that that's a national organization.
Yeah, your book, it doesn't focus on lynching. I'm sure there are individual books on lynching, but it's really astonishingly horrifying to understand the number of lynchings. It wasn't just an occasional event. This was built into the very culture of America in the 20s.
Right, right. And the protest against lynching goes way back in the Black community. People have been trying to get people to hear. Black people have been trying to get the nation to hear how horrific it is. But every time an anti-lynching bill is introduced, it's blocked, it's voted down, it doesn't get out of committee. I mean, we didn't have a federal anti-lynching bill until the last couple of years. That's how long it took to pass an anti-lynching bill with both houses of Congress and have the president sign it. So these concerns, I think the community shares. For African Americans in the 1920s, for Black Americans, the majority of Black Americans live in the South, and the majority of people are agricultural workers. And agricultural workers probably do have very specific, if you think about in terms of labor and in terms of the kinds of conditions that they face, that's probably pretty specific in comparison to urban dwellers. I mean, everybody's segregated, but agricultural workers in the South, in terms of their relationship to being able to own land and being prevented from that, the system of sharecropping, where people are basically kind of held in a new form of enslavement by landlords who, you know, in exchange for their crops, link people to the land forever. You can't get out of debt. You never ever can pay the landlord's debt. So in that case, that's a very specific kind of concern for people in agricultural areas.
You've warned about looking at Black America in a monolithic sense. What about in political terms? Your book begins with Booker T. Washington. You just mentioned W.E.B. Du Bois, two of the greatest intellectual political figures in early 20th century Black American history. They didn't agree about a great deal. What were the debates about compromising with white America, believing in the American Republic in the 20s? Who was debating who, and what, in your view, were the most interesting conversations taking place within Black America in the 20s?
In the 20s, Booker T. Washington, he passes away in 1915, and that kind of opens the...
But sorry to interrupt, Jill, but he left an intellectual legacy, a certain school, a way of thinking about Black America.
I think he did. I mean, I think with his death, though, there's more freedom to move. Do you know what I'm saying? He was such a powerful leader, and to disagree with Booker T. Washington could bring, you could be silenced. Washington had so much control, say, over portions of the media. But I think that, you know, there's still that question between what kind of education should Black Americans receive, the Tuskegee model of vocational education,
right,
or W.E.B. Du Bois's idea of classical education for the talented 10th. That debate's still going, but there's people who call themselves straddlers. One of the great examples of that is Mary McLeod Bethune. She's putting together a school that she talks about as a vocational school, which is now Bethune-Cookman University. But at the same time, she's definitely emphasizing classical education, the idea that people need both. And so to sell it to white Southerners, she's kind of marketing it as vocational. But to prepare young Black people as leaders, she's giving them something that's well-rounded. So the education debate is there. And there's also kind of a debate about straddling the line between the parties. there's an idea that if you went nonpartisan within the black community, you could swing certain elections in certain areas. So instead of just being a monolith and voting for Republicans, you know, or taking Democrats and saying, well, you know, maybe a few of us can go over there. What if you didn't really affiliate with any party? What if you let the parties fight for your vote? And with black women getting that vote, it enriches the number of black votes that are out there. So there are people who are saying, well, you know, what if we didn't have any allegiance to any party, because none of them are representing us? And so there's that debate going on in the 20s. And there's also the debate between Marcus Garvey.
Right, I was going to mention Garvey, the idea that America has failed black America, slavery, post-slavery, and that the smartest thing to do is to leave, go back to Africa.
Yeah, separatism. So separatism here within the nation.
How powerful was Garvey in that school in the 20s in America?
I think up until about 26, 27, he's really very much a part of the debate. And I think, you know, the U.S. government really marshals forces in order to silence him, and eventually you're able to deport him.
What's your take on the three Republican presidents of the 20s, Harding, then Coolidge and Hoover, when it came to black American politics and addressing this profound injustice at the heart of the American Republic?
I don't, I have to disagree. I don't think they stack up
Don't be
very
shy
well.
to disagree with Amity. She loves everyone who disagrees with her. Everybody disagrees with Amity.
Yeah. No, the record isn't good at all. I mean, if you kick it off with Harding, and Harding saying things like amalgamation there cannot be.
Yeah, you mentioned that in your black cabinet.
And no attempt to really curb the activities of the Ku Klux Klan, which continues into the Coolidge administration. No attention being paid to the suffering of black Americans in any way, not getting behind lynching legislation. And following it into the Hoover administration. I mean, the Hoover administration really is a disaster for black Americans. Nobody is looking at the conditions in black America and addressing them in any real way. Coolidge and Hoover appoint Bethune as an advisor.
Perhaps you might introduce Bethune to our audience, because you're writing a biography of her now, and she's the central figure in the black cabinet. Yeah. So explain who she is and why she's so important.
Mary McLeod Bethune is the daughter of sharecroppers born in South Carolina at the end of Reconstruction, 1875. And she becomes the first black woman to found a historically black college in America. And in fact, she's the first and still the only black woman to found a historically black college. But she's known as an educator and also a women's club leader, and that's very interesting because she uses that as a political movement, mobilizing black women into politics. So Bethune is also very interested in kind of working into American politics and sees American politics as a vehicle to address the needs of black people. So I think those Republican presidents, she's kind of interested, as are many other black leaders, in working with them or getting them to hear their voices. I think the idea is to get into the party and then get appointments. That working from outside can only do so much, but if you can get inside the government, then you can bring change via that vehicle. So,
as a black American, as opposed to a white American who cared about black American issues?
I'm sorry?
In terms of that strategy, I mean, was there a debate amongst whether the key thing was to get black Americans into office as opposed to white Americans who were concerned with the issues of black Americans?
I think so. I mean, I think that working with what we now call white allies wasn't out of the question for most people. But I think that getting people to understand that having people who experience the experience is really important. Asking them questions, giving them the power to consult on policy. I think that that's really central, and I think it goes along with that spirit of the 1920s. You have the Harlem Renaissance, the kind of rebirth of celebrating black culture across the board, and going hand in hand with that is is black politics.
Where were the white allies? Your term in the 20s, were they on the left? Were they amongst European leftists, socialists, perhaps even communists?
In the 20s, white allies? I think that's a really good question. I think that's what black people were asking themselves. They should have been in the Republican Party. That's where they were supposed to be, but they weren't.
But what about the labor movement? Debs, Emma Goldman?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that there was attempts to work across those lines. If you look at A. Philip Randolph and his organization of union and union workers, he does find sympathy on the left. But also you find the women's clubs. As women, I know I'm going back to women's suffrage, but that's a big deal. Those women's clubs, black and white women start working together, and you find in allegiance together, say in the South, articulating the need for anti-lynching legislation, which is something the country and the presidents were kind of like, oh, I don't want to touch that, I don't want to talk about that. But white and black women are working together on those issues. I mean, and then you have in New York, you have the kind of, I don't really know if you want to call them elite. Yeah, maybe. Yeah, the New York elite, who are, you might identify them on the left, but the kind of cultural elite that kind of open the door and are interested in black arts. And I think that, by opening that opportunity to publish and to create art that circulates, that educates the American public, and so they do a service too.
Jill, you mentioned that the 20s was a period of great cultural vitality, also of economic vitality until the Wall Street crash. How much did Black America share the economic bonanza of the 20s?
No, it's not economic vitality for most Black Americans at all. Black Americans never saw the prosperity or the boom of the 1920s. Very few people were able to cash in on that stock market and then watch it crash. For Black Americans, poverty was the reality. Like I said, the vast majority of people live in the South. They sharecrop, and they live in tremendous poverty. So the Roaring 20s kind of roars right past economically most Black people. It's the same in the urban areas. I know I'm painting a dismal portrait, but it's a reality that people need to accept, that prosperity was just a surface prosperity for a select group of Americans. And I think one of the things is when you leave such a large swath of Americans behind, that you don't really have a strong economy. It just looked strong on the surface, but there were a lot of people, in addition to Black people, who were not partaking in that party of the 1920s economically at all. So you already have a depression in the Black community. The Black community has never been able to climb out of economic subjugation that they've been confined to back to the period of enslavement. I mean, people were, and there were still people alive who had been enslaved. When this period of time we're talking about, people were given their freedom, but literally nothing more than, here's your freedom. And then given a set of rules which prevented them from advancing in any kind of way.
And to make an already dismal story even more dismal, with the Great Crash, with the Great Depression, the situation of Black America became even worse. It wasn't as if white America simply joined Black Americans in poverty. The poverty of Black America was compounded by the Great Depression. What happened after 1929 in Black America?
I think that you found a desperate situation that became even more desperate. The Depression, what it does is it widens and deepens an already ongoing economic crisis for Black America. And so, what's it the old saying, last hired, first fired? If you'd made any inroads, you found that those things evaporated. But for most communities, say with the crash and then up to 33, there's nothing coming from the federal government. There's no help, no assistance. The philosophy is self-help, individualism, pull yourself up by the bootstraps. I think there was an idea that, oh, prosperity's just around the corner. So we're going to turn the corner eventually. And for Black Americans, there wasn't any corner. There was no prosperity out there. And it wasn't going to come back because it never had been there. So, and without the federal government's protection, things were just going to get worse and worse and worse. And that's exactly what they did. You starvation in rural areas. You find people who had been sharecropping and barely making it as sharecroppers, either forced off the land or landlords just taking the land out of cultivation. And you could stay, but you couldn't really plant, so you couldn't really make much other than scratch out of maybe a kitchen garden. Healthcare, right? If you think about healthcare as such a big issue for us today, and was nil before and even worse after. You think, how could things get worse? And they did. It's unimaginable, the suffering that people were enduring in the urban areas as well, with the loss of jobs. You know, the unemployment rate for Black Americans, say at the height of the Depression, was nearly double that of the national average. That's unbelievable when you think about it.
And how did it impact Black American politics? Did it drive more and more Black Americans into becoming radicals, revolutionaries, hostile to American democracy and the whole promise of the American Republic?
You know, I think for most well, if you look at the nation as a whole, what happens to American politics, right? There is a broader interest in the left and the ideas of the left, right? Across the board, and Black Americans are no different. But I think also there's and the immediate kind of question that arises in 32 is, do we stick with Republicans? If you think about that, you know, do we stick with the Republicans? Are they going to get us out of this mess? Is Hoover going to help? And I think that question becomes planted because of the economic crisis. And then in terms of kind of negotiating and kind of moving through that period of time, there's a group of Black Americans that decide, you know, maybe it's time to defect and go Democrat, which is almost unthinkable for many people because Democrats are so associated with the Klan and the Confederacy and white Southern racism. So people are starting to, I think it triggers that kind of idea about moving between. What I really think is interesting, Andrew, is when we talk about, you know, change in America and the political landscape, we often say, well, people go left. We were trained to think, oh, people are going to go left, or there's going to be a revolution, right? We never ask that question about going right. If you think about it, in the time, in the 30s, people were a little worried by the mid-30s that the country might swing to the right.
You were talking about how that it's wrong to think of the New Deal as benefiting Black America. You suggested that Black America was shaping the New Deal itself. It's wrong to see it in such simplistic terms.
I think one of the main contributions that the Black New Dealers make is this way of detecting the presence of discrimination. When Black Americans complained of being discriminated against in New Deal programs, and they were initially, the early part of the New Deal, Black Americans weren't getting any relief, virtually none. And what you'd have to do is go in and complain as an individual. So the case-by-case basis to a local administrator, you'd never get heard. But when they began looking at this, they realized if you saw a community where you had predominantly Black residents, you know, say like a city like Atlanta, where none of the New Deal programs were hiring any Black Americans, that was clear that was clearly had to be discrimination. So we were able to evolve these concepts of, you know, of looking at population and proportion, and in a lot of ways that lays the groundwork for later affirmative action in order to, you know, sort out when discrimination occurs at the larger level, rather than tying people up in the individual level and they're never able to make their case and never able to receive the relief they need. So I think that that's important. I think that a lot of the Black Cabinet's agenda, lynching, anti-lynching legislation, on broader health care, voting rights, a lot of that didn't get achieved. But the fact that they were there to raise those issues was really important. The fact that they were those voices within the government saying, you need to pay attention to this, that lays the groundwork. In a lot of ways, these black appointees in Roosevelt's administration, who comprise the black cabinet, in a lot of ways, what they do is they're this bridge generation between those earlier activists, Du Bois, Booker T. Washington. I want to add in Ida Wells.
Yeah.
Okay, and then the later generation of Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Rosa Parks. There's a bridge there. And what they're able to demonstrate is that working within the inside makes a big difference if you've got a voice inside. A lot of their achievement has to do with what they were able to prevent from happening. Okay. They were implementing wage differentials in New Deal programs. If there was a jobs program, they were allowing white employers to hire black workers for less than white workers. And so they protested that. And there were cases in which they won that. In other cases, they didn't entirely win that. But if they had allowed the federal government ad hoc to just impose wage differentials, for example, that was institutionalizing Jim Crow at the federal level. And I think they prevented an institutionalization at the federal level of Jim Crow. And that's a big deal. If you think about it, you don't often credit people for stopping things from happening. You want people to do things that make things happen. So,
Jill, earlier in the series, we did an interview with Derek Liebart, another historian of the FDR period, who's written a book about FDR's 4 lieutenants, all white, 3 men and a woman. Your book, The Black Cabinet, focuses on a different group of black Americans working within the FDR administration. Tell us a little bit about this black cabinet and how it interfaced with the other figures surrounding FDR.
The black cabinet was an unofficial group, and it was named by black journalists. And it was nothing that FDR ever sanctioned or acknowledged existed. And
as you note in the book, it has a history that goes way before FDR.
Right. There's an earlier formation of a black cabinet under Theodore Roosevelt. But that breaks up under the later presidents, both Democrat and Republican. And when FDR gets back into office, he's pressured to appoint black Americans. And the Democrats give in to that because they think, we might be able to get black Americans to cross over and vote for us. That's another very important accomplishment, that these black advisors participate in this movement between the Republican and Democratic Party. And so this group is kind of ad hoc and disorganized. It's mostly male for its early years of existence, say from 1933 to 1935. And it's comprised of all different generations, people from all different, you have Ivy League PhDs like Robert Weaver, who's in the Department of Interior, and his childhood friend, William Hastie, who's a law degree from Harvard. And then you have Al Smith, who's a country boy from Arkansas.
Very different Al Smith from the Democratic machine politician who ran for president in 1928.
Right. As a child, he grows up. He, as a young boy, he experiences tremendous poverty, and he works his way up. And he goes to Howard University. He gets a degree there, and he ends up in the FDR administration as the largest, as the head of the largest works program for Black Americans in the entire administration, the WPA. So, and then there's some old-time political hacks, as they say, right? And so they don't get along. And then in 1936, FDR appoints Mary McLeod Bethune as the first black woman to head a federal agency's program. She heads up the black division of the National Youth Administration. And Bethune is such an icon in America at this time. This is the first lady of Black America, right? That's what she's known as. And she tells these guys, you will come to my house on Friday night in August after work, and we will have a meeting. And she calls them in and says, you can't be divided. You have to start to work together. We're going to have a real black cabinet, and we're going to share information, and we're going to work together, and we'll march forward. So you go from this period of time where they're in their different agencies kind of making progress independently and kind of getting together in different groups, but not really walking forward together, to the second period under which Bethune kind of assumes control and leadership. And Bethune's important because she has this friendship with Eleanor Roosevelt, and she's able to get black requests directly to the president. This is something the group hadn't been able to do. And then you find it kind of really moves the Black New Deal, as I'm calling it, ahead. So this second phase under Bethune's leadership really moves people ahead. And it's because of her connection with Eleanor Roosevelt. And she's able to, for instance, force the government to sponsor 2 major conferences on the problems of Black America. The government has never done anything like that. She's able to get the information that Black cabinet members have been collecting out to the public. She's able to get more funding to flow into Black New Deal programs. She's also able to, and that means more Black people get work, more Black people get scholarships, more education, more health care. And it's because she's this kind of dynamic, articulate leader who, the young men, they were all, graduated with a PhD from Harvard in economics, and here are the numbers. So she's so dynamic. She gets people to pay attention and hear what's really going on in Black America, make the case. And so it opens this up for that period of time. The tragedy of this is she's envisioning all of these programs as becoming permanent. I mean, if you could think about it today, can you imagine, say, educational programs at the federal level that were funding state colleges, historically Black universities, if they were really pumping money into places where it was needed, what kind of nation you would have? Or work programs. If you lose a job in a tough economy, imagine if you had those work programs. I mean, we've attempted to continue those, but not at the level where you say, well, there's really this group of people targeted that need this help. Public housing. Her idea was a lot of this became permanent, ingrained within the government as permanent programs. And that's what she hoped for. But with the war coming, the funding dries up and they move the funding over into the defense industry. Not that you shouldn't, you needed to fight the war, but with that it sort of brings the end of that heyday.
We did a show earlier in the series with Alida Black, a scholar of Eleanor Roosevelt. You've talked a little bit about Eleanor as the bridge to FDR, as providing Black America to access for them. What do you make of Eleanor in terms of her commitment? Was this the central issue for her in her moral artillery? Did she feel that this was the great crime in American history and that it needed to be addressed?
She may have thought that it was enslavement and that history of racism. She may have thought that was the great crime, but I think Eleanor Roosevelt was a pretty complex thinker, and she's in a way thinking ahead of her time and thinking in terms of class discrimination and gender discrimination as well. But her commitment to Black Americans, I think, in this period of time really grows. I think when she first starts as First Lady, she's in one place, but by the time she's done, she's in a completely different place.
And I mean, she's a scion of the leading family. She's the niece of Teddy Roosevelt, the wife of FDR, a white woman of great aristocratic economic privilege. Where did all this come from for her, this concern with Black America?
Well, I think the thing about Eleanor is that she has all these privileges, but her own background, and I know you've probably heard this before, is one of great challenge. I think she has a fractured family. She's sent off, though, to Europe to study, and I think she's exposed to progressives in Europe. She comes back here and works in a settlement house. And so she kind of develops a social awareness that FDR doesn't have, and that a lot of white women in her class and generation don't have. But by 1927, she meets Mary McLeod Bethune, and Bethune has a tremendous impact on her, especially once Bethune comes to Washington, D.C. in 1936. They form this very fast friendship, and it's a friendship that I think is genuine, but I also think it's a friendship that it's a quid pro quo. You know, she knows Bethune represents black votes, and Bethune knows that Eleanor Roosevelt represents a bridge to FDR and things that black people need. As much as they liked each other, and I think they did, I think that there's, and Bethune becomes such a constant presence, I think, in Eleanor Roosevelt's life. It's a way of Eleanor Roosevelt herself. She talks about that relationship as it blossoms is transformational for her, and that she sees her own prejudices and starts to overcome them. So I think that's what's so interesting about this New Deal program. It's not just the change in the nation, but you see somebody like Eleanor Roosevelt change personally.
Jill, FDR elicited enormous hostility on the right amongst conservatives. Sometimes it doesn't make a lot of sense, given that, as you suggested, he was politically very astute, a centrist, trying to keep a remarkably diverse party and political group together. I wonder whether some of the hostility against the FDR, the way he was villainized and turned into the devil incarnate, was actually the old racism funneled back into American politics, particularly given the fact that his administration, if not him, for the first time in American history was actually committed to black America.
Oh, sure. I mean, you see Eleanor Roosevelt taking most of that hit and being trounced by the right wing white segregationists, especially in Georgia, and the famous Eugene Talmadge attack on FDR. A lot of that, Talmadge used the idea that FDR was empowering black people and giving black people rights in order to fan that racist voting base of his in the South. And so I think, yeah, it was a convenient kind of default for the right wing of America in that period of time, the racist factions in the South, especially white Southern senators, and some of the House of Representatives in his own party. And you know, he tries to purge them in 1938. He attempts to get rid of that group not because of their racist, though, their racist attitudes. He tries to get rid of them because he sees them as a block to the New Deal overall. But I mean, some of those fellows that he attempted to unseat unsuccessfully, some of those were some of his biggest opponents in terms of the issue of race as well. So
we began, Jill, with the First World War. Let's end with the Second World War. We've done shows also about FDR in the Second World War. You noted at the beginning that black Americans went off to fight in the First World War, believing that this would help their cause when it came to civil rights, in political civil rights, cultural civil rights in America. Was it a similar situation in terms of war in 1941 after Pearl Harbor? Did black Americans once again march in the American army because they thought it might make political sense, and that if they could win the war they would come back to a fairer America?
I think so. I think there was again a hope to step up and fight for democracy, that democracy at home would come. The Pittsburgh Courier, the famous black newspaper, and the thing about black newspapers in that period of time, they had national circulation. The Courier carried on what they called the double V campaign, victory at home and victory abroad. And the victory at home was over Jim Crow and over segregation and over disenfranchisement. So I think that the hope was there. I think, though, that you find this generation, maybe a little more jaded. And
or worldly, perhaps.
Yeah.
More realistic.
I mean, many people remembered well what happened the first time with the First World War, when people came home and the rights were denied. But I think that even though they were more skeptical, and I think there were a number of people who felt that they had gone and served their country, and that again the country wouldn't turn its back, and this time they were determined that it wouldn't happen. It's interesting because you have that kind of spirit, and you have the rhetoric of, well, whatever, we've all got to get behind this because there's a bigger problem in Hitler and in the Axis powers than what we have here at home. But it exposes the hypocrisy of America. And I think that's really a different dynamic than you had in World War I, where you had the Hitler as the great evil enemy and articulating white supremacy, and people able to say, well, a lot of what Hitler says we can find right here in our white Southern newspapers or our white political leaders. They're saying the same thing as they have been for a long time. So it exposes America for its idea that, you know, we're holding up the democratic process and promise, and we're going to go over there and fight Hitler because he represents a threat to that. But it raises that question, you know, is this really a democracy? You know, is this democracy for me, right? That's what Langston Hughes poses. You know, how long do I have to fight and who? And so in a way it opens up that debate even further, because Hitler becomes this icon of world white supremacy.
And finally, Jill, you mentioned in the First World War there were still black Americans around who had been slaves. I think by 1945 there probably weren't. If they
few people.
one or two left, but they would have been very old. For an American, a black American who came of age as an adult in the period between the First and the Second World War in the 1920s and 30s, when they brushed their teeth at night, when they daydreamed about their place in America, do you think that they would have concluded by 1945 that finally black America, things hadn't, of course, been completely righted, but finally black Americans had a home in this supposedly democratic republic, this supposed city on the hill?
When you say home, what do you mean?
That's for you as the historian. It's meant in a metaphorical sense.
Uh-huh.
That they were part of America as opposed to simply being excluded in every sense.
No, I don't think that. I don't think people in 1945, as the war winds down, I don't think so. I think people are clear-eyed about what happened. I think that people may be hopeful that we're about to have change, but how different is America really in 1945 compared to 1918? Has lynching stopped? Did the Klan go away? Do more people have the right to vote? Economically, where are people at? I actually think, though, there's some glimmer of hope in terms of what the New Deal laid out. You maybe built a foundation for a black middle class. You saw the escalation of black activism within the government and then outside the government. I think that there's a lot of hopeful signs, but in terms of has democracy really fulfilled its promise to black people, I don't think in 1935, I don't think people were, they knew there was a long way still to go.
Well, there's a long way still to go in our series of American democracy, 1924 to 2024. Jill Watts, I want to thank you so much for such a coherent and complex, a simultaneously coherent and complex introduction to Black America in the 20s and 30s. Thank you so much. There's still so much to come, and we will certainly return to the subject of Black America and civil rights in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. But Jill Watts, for the moment, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me and for such a great conversation.